Hello YouTube. We're continuing our discussion of slavery in the Bible. We've now turned our attention to slavery in the New Testament, or slavery that was being dealt with during the Apostles' time. In the previous video, I spent quite a bit of time discussing the similarities and differences between New World slavery and slavery that was administered under the Roman Empire. I would encourage you to look at that video now if you haven't already. That way you can pick up with the discussion here. The Roman term for slavery was actually service, which we oftentimes get our term servant from. And many Bible translations use this word rather than slave for many of the relevant translations. The English word slave comes from the Middle Latin word Slav, the connection being that during the eastern expansion of the Germans in the Middle Ages, the Slav populations were either enslaved or destroyed, something much closer to the horror of the New World slavery. Any socio-economic class that people would voluntarily join to achieve greater social status than they could being free, allowed a servant legal rights against their owner, gave the servant the ability to force change of owner by seeking asylum, created a realistic expectation of freedom with Roman citizenship around the age of 30 years of age, provided much greater material comfort, security, and earning potential than free status, provided access to educational training often unaffordable to the free poor, can hardly be called slavery in any New World or modern day sense, or as we define it, oftentimes it's the non-consensual ownership. Actually, it looks more like the rigor and discipline and submission to superiors that shows up in modern military enrollments, in which people submit to military life for a fixed time in exchange for training, post-service educational payments, medical care, and the like after their term of military service. The gap between the New Testament servanthood and the New World or modern-day slavery is simply too great for us to identify them with each other. Point number 2. Given the actual character of New Testament slavery, what should have been a Christian response to it in 1st century AD? As a socio-economic institution, it had a massively ambiguous character. Slavery could be entered into by a slave as a stepping stone for socially ambitious means. Slavery could be violently forced upon a captive of war, a captive of a slave trader. Slavery could be used as a means of social bragging by the elite. Freedom could be used as a means of social bragging by the elite. Slaves could be subjected to ranges of abuses by masters as well as fear and intimidation. Masters could be subjected to fear, assassination, and a wide range of pilferages by the slaves. The institution itself created social inequality between the master and the slave, sometimes a barrier to community. But sometimes the institution created strong personal bonds between the master and the slave to the point of marriage or adoption. Freedom could be used by the master to avoid caring for the needs of his slaves, such as abandonment of old slaves or sick slaves to die. Slavery could be used to provide comprehensive life care during non-productive years, such as infancy or childhood, for slaves born in the household or rescued from infant abandonment. Point being, in the Roman world, freedom was not always good, but slavery was not always bad. And what was one to legislate about the institution? Given its amazing variety and ethnically polymorphous character, might be incredibly difficult to determine and perhaps even vary case by case. Some of the most obvious things we might expect in the New Testament would be these. The New Testament emphasis against arrogance and boasting would preclude either bragging efforts. Any desire for selfish ambition as opposed to obedient betterment would be rebuked. The general anti-oppression or mistreatment ethnic of the Old Testament might preclude slave trading, and I've already devoted nine videos to the Old Testament. Slave trading would have been illegal. A lot of the abuse and barbarism that we associate with slavery would have just been outright outlawed and considered sinful. The biblical emphasis on kindness towards others and respect and goodness would preclude abuses by slaves by their masters, as well as respectful behavior towards owners. The biblical emphasis on a new creation in Christ via identification with his death would argue for removal of any or many of the ethnic, social, or cultural barriers between people. The biblical element of covenant loyalty would argue that both the master and the slave would be held accountable for their respective side of the relationship to their responsibilities to one another. The biblical motive of Christ as Lord over all elements of created existence would argue that all relationships would be transformed by his lordship. Given the complex institution, or the complex situation, we should not expect blanket commandments to free the slaves, if for no other reason than the abandonment of infants or infant death, of infant slaves, and the aged and sick slaves could become critically destitute. The emphasis on non-legalism, limited hierarchy or hierarchical authority, and conscience-based decision-making in the New Testament might suggest that the decision concerning any specific master-slave situation not be solved by unilateral apostle pronouncements, but rather by individuals in the midst of the situation. Given the potential abuses in the system, we would not we would not expect an enthusiastic endorsement of slavery either. In the next video, we will turn our attention to the actual response, we find in the writings in the New Testament, especially Paul. Thank you.